They called me the family disappointment, said my government job was just pushing papers in some forgotten office, but that Thanksgiving when Air Force One touched down in the field behind our house and the uniformed officers saluted me, everything changed. The autumn wind was cutting through the bare oak trees that surrounded our family farm, and I could smell the turkey roasting inside while my relatives gathered around the dining room table, their voices already raised in the familiar chorus of achievements and comparisons that happened every holiday. I stood on the back porch, watching the gray clouds gather overhead, knowing that in a few minutes I would walk into that warm house and become the target of their well-meaning but cutting remarks about my quiet life in Washington. The phone in my pocket had been buzzing all morning with encrypted messages, but here, surrounded by the rolling hills of rural Virginia, I was just Alex, the one who never quite measured up to family expectations. Before I share what happened next, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are watching from. I love hearing how my story reaches people in places I never imagined, and somehow that makes what I'm about to tell you feel even more real. I pushed open the screen door and stepped into the chaos of my extended family's annual gathering. My cousin Marcus was already holding court near the fireplace, his voice booming as he described his latest real estate deal that had netted him enough commission to buy a new BMW. His wife Sarah nodded along, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured, adding details about their upcoming trip to Cabo that would cost more than I made in 3 months. My sister Jennifer was arranging flowers in the center of the dining table, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen where our mother was orchestrating the meal with military precision. Jennifer had always been the golden child, the one who married the successful lawyer and lived in the house with the perfect lawn and the 2 perfect children who attended private school and played violin. The conversation stopped when I walked in, not because anyone was particularly excited to see me, but because my arrival meant they could finally begin the annual ritual of polite interrogation disguised as family interest. Uncle Robert, who owned a chain of hardware stores across 3 counties, looked up from his bourbon and gave me that smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been asking me the same questions for 5 years now, ever since I graduated college, and disappointed everyone by taking what they considered a dead-end government position instead of following Marcus into real estate or Jennifer into teaching. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron and giving me the look that mothers reserve for children who are perpetually failing to live up to their potential. She had spent years telling her friends about Marcus's business success and Jennifer's beautiful family, but when it came to me, the conversations always grew quiet and changed direction. I was the son who worked somewhere in Washington doing something with computers and paperwork, the one who couldn't explain exactly what his job entailed because it was boring and complicated and not worth discussing at dinner parties. Aunt Linda, who had driven down from Baltimore with her husband and their twin daughters who were both pre-med students, set down her wine glass and prepared to launch into her favorite topic of conversation. She loved to compare her daughter's academic achievements to the rest of the family, and somehow I always ended up being the cautionary tale in her stories. Her twins were brilliant and driven and destined for success, while I was the example of what happened when you settled for mediocrity and took the first job that offered decent health insurance. The questions began the way they always did, with Uncle Robert clearing his throat and asking how things were going at work, his tone suggesting that he already knew the answer would be disappointing. I gave him the same response I always gave, explaining that I worked for a government agency doing data analysis and security assessments, which was technically true, but sounded exactly as boring as they expected it to sound. Marcus jumped in with his usual suggestion that I should consider getting into real estate, insisting that someone with my education and work ethic could make real money if I just applied myself to something with actual potential for advancement. Jennifer tried to be supportive in her way, asking if there were opportunities for promotion in my department, but even her encouragement felt like gentle pity for my lack of ambition. She had married her college sweetheart right after graduation and never had to worry about building a career from scratch, so my struggles with finding direction and purpose seemed foreign to her experience. Her husband David nodded along, occasionally offering advice about networking and professional development that made sense in his world of corporate law but had no application to my actual situation. The twins, home from their sophomore year at Johns Hopkins, looked at me with the polite disinterest of young people who had already decided they would never end up in my situation. They were focused and driven and surrounded by other students who were going to change the world, while I represented the kind of ordinary existence they were determined to avoid. Aunt Linda made sure to mention their latest academic achievements, their research opportunities, and their plans for medical school, each accomplishment highlighting by contrast my own apparent lack of direction and success. My father, who had been quiet through most of this exchange, finally spoke up from his recliner near the window. He had worked for the Postal Service for 30 years before retiring, and he understood government employment in a way the rest of the family never would, but even he seemed puzzled by my career choices. He asked gentle questions about my day-to-day responsibilities, trying to understand what I actually did with my time and whether I found any satisfaction in my work. His questions came from a place of genuine concern rather than judgment, but they still highlighted how little my family understood about my life in Washington. The conversation drifted away from my career and moved on to other topics, but I could feel the familiar weight of their collective disappointment settling over me like a heavy blanket. They talked about Marcus's latest investment property and Jennifer's promotion to department head at her school, about the twins' summer internships at prestigious hospitals and David's partnership track at his law firm. I listened and nodded and contributed when appropriate, but part of me was always calculating how soon I could politely excuse myself and return to my small apartment in Arlington. What they didn't know, what I had never been able to tell them, was that my boring government job required a security clearance that had taken 18 months to obtain. They didn't know that the data analysis I did involved terrorist financing networks and cyber threats from hostile foreign governments. They couldn't know that the meetings I attended sometimes included generals and cabinet secretaries, or that the reports I wrote were briefed to people whose names appeared in history books. The phone calls I received at odd hours weren't from telemarketers or coworkers with mundane questions. They were from analysts in Langley and officers at the Pentagon who needed my expertise on matters that could affect national security. My mother called everyone to the dinner table, and we gathered around the spread she had been preparing since dawn. The turkey was golden and perfect, surrounded by dishes that represented generations of family recipes and traditions. Uncle Robert said grace, thanking God for family and health and the blessings of another year together, and I bowed my head and tried to feel grateful instead of isolated. The conversation around the table continued in the same patterns it had followed for years, with updates on children and careers and vacation plans that felt like competitions disguised as sharing. Marcus was describing his plans to expand into commercial real estate when my phone began to vibrate against my leg. I ignored it at first, knowing that any interruption would be seen as rudeness and would provide more ammunition for their theories about my lack of focus and commitment. But the vibrating continued in the pattern that meant the message was marked urgent, and then it stopped and started again immediately, which meant someone was trying to reach me about something that couldn't wait for normal business hours or family dinners. I excused myself quietly and stepped into the hallway, pulling out my phone to see a message that made my stomach drop. The text was brief and coded, but I understood immediately that something significant was happening and that my presence was required in Washington as soon as possible. I stood in my mother's hallway, surrounded by family photos and childhood memories, and tried to process the implications of what I was reading while the sounds of dinner conversation and laughter continued from the dining room. The second message arrived while I was still staring at the first one, and this one included details that made it clear this was not a routine situation that could wait until Monday morning. Someone very important needed information that only I had access to, and there were people already in motion to ensure that I could provide that information as quickly as possible. I looked through the hallway toward the dining room, where my family was continuing their meal and their conversations about real estate deals and medical school applications, completely unaware that their disappointing relative was about to leave them in a way they had never imagined. The third message contained coordinates and a timeline that made my heart race. I had been through scenarios like this in training exercises, but this was the first time the protocols were being activated for a real situation that required my immediate attention. I walked back toward the dining room, already calculating how to excuse myself without causing alarm or requiring explanations that I couldn't provide. My family looked up as I returned to my seat, and I could see the questions in their eyes as they noticed the change in my expression and posture. I sat down and picked up my fork, trying to appear normal while my mind raced through the procedures I would need to follow and the timeline I had been given. Marcus was still talking about commercial properties when the sound of helicopters became audible in the distance, growing louder as they approached our rural location. The conversation at the table slowed and then stopped as everyone registered the unusual noise, and several people moved toward the windows to see what was happening outside. My phone buzzed one more time with a message that simply read 2 minutes out, and I knew that everything was about to change in ways that would shatter my family's understanding of who I really was and what my boring government job actually entailed. The sound of rotor blades grew thunderous as 2 Black Hawks appeared over the tree-line, their dark silhouettes cutting through the gray November sky like mechanical birds of prey. My family pressed against the dining room windows, their faces reflecting confusion and growing alarm as the helicopters circled our property before beginning their descent toward the open field behind our house. Jennifer grabbed her children and pulled them away from the windows, while Marcus fumbled for his phone to start recording what he assumed was some kind of emergency or accident happening in our quiet rural neighborhood. My mother's face had gone pale as she watched the aircraft settle into the field, their powerful rotors whipping the dead autumn leaves into swirling clouds of brown and gold. She turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and confusion that made her appear suddenly fragile and much older than her 62 years. Uncle Robert was already reaching for his jacket, assuming he might need to offer assistance to whoever was in those military helicopters. But I knew that the only person they were here for was sitting at this dinner table trying to finish his Thanksgiving meal. The helicopters powered down their engines, but kept their rotors spinning, which meant this was a quick pickup rather than a planned landing. Through the window, I could see figures in military uniforms emerging from the aircraft and moving across the field toward our house with the purposeful stride of people who had done this before. My phone buzzed again with a message that simply read "Stand by for escort," and I realized that my carefully maintained double life was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. David, my brother-in-law, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking when he asked if anyone knew why military helicopters were landing in our backyard. His legal training had kicked in, and he was already considering the possibilities of emergency evacuations or national security incidents that might require civilian assistance. Aunt Linda was herding her daughters away from the windows while simultaneously trying to get a better look at what was happening outside, her protective instincts warring with her curiosity about this unprecedented disruption of our family gathering. I stood up from the table slowly, my movements careful and deliberate as I processed the reality that my 2 worlds were about to collide in a way I had never anticipated. For 5 years, I had successfully compartmentalized my life in Washington from my family relationships, maintaining the fiction that I was just another government bureaucrat pushing papers in an anonymous office building. The security briefings had covered many scenarios, but none of them had involved having to explain my real job to relatives who thought I was a disappointment. The doorbell rang with sharp authority, not the casual chime of friends or neighbors, but the insistent sound of people who expected immediate response. My father moved toward the front door, but I intercepted him gently, placing my hand on his shoulder and telling him that I would handle this. The confusion in his eyes deepened as he registered something different in my voice, an authority and confidence that he had never heard from his supposedly underachieving son. Through the front windows, I could see 2 officers in dress uniforms standing on our porch, their posture and bearing unmistakably military. Behind them, additional personnel were maintaining a security perimeter around the property, their presence both protective and intimidating. These were not local emergency responders or curious officials investigating a noise complaint. These were federal agents and military personnel who had been dispatched to collect someone whose expertise was urgently needed by people at the highest levels of government. I opened the front door to face a Navy commander and an Air Force colonel, both of whom saluted me with the crisp precision of career military officers. The commander spoke first, addressing me by a title that made my family's collective intake of breath audible from the dining room behind me. He informed me that I was needed for an immediate briefing regarding a developing situation that required my specific knowledge and clearance level, and that transportation had been arranged to get me to Washington within the hour. The colonel handed me a secure phone and stepped back while I confirmed my identity and availability for the mission that was being described in coded language. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but in that time I received more information about the gravity of the situation and my role in addressing it. When I ended the call and handed the phone back, both officers were watching me with the respect and deference that my family had never seen directed toward their disappointing relative. Behind me, I could hear whispered conversations and urgent questions as my family tried to process what they were witnessing. Marcus had stopped recording and was staring at the uniformed officers with growing comprehension that this was not a random emergency, but something specifically connected to me. Jennifer was holding her children closer, her teacher instincts telling her that something significant was happening even if she couldn't understand exactly what it was. The commander informed me that I had 10 minutes to gather whatever materials I needed and that civilian clothes would be acceptable for the initial briefing. He mentioned that appropriate attire would be provided for any meetings that required formal dress codes, which told me that this situation involved high-level officials who would expect proper protocols. I nodded and turned back toward my family, knowing that I had to provide some explanation for what was happening without revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations. What I couldn't tell them, what the security oaths prevented me from explaining, was that my boring data analysis job had made me one of the leading experts on cyber warfare patterns from hostile foreign governments. The reports I wrote in my quiet Arlington office were briefed to the National Security Council and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The meetings I attended that I described as routine training sessions were actually strategic planning conferences where generals and intelligence directors sought my input on threats that could destabilize entire regions. 3 years earlier, I had been recruited from my entry-level position by a deputy director who recognized that my background in computer science and international relations made me uniquely qualified to analyze the intersection of technology and geopolitical conflict. The selection process had taken 8 months and included psychological evaluations, polygraph examinations, and background investigations that interviewed neighbors I had forgotten I ever had. When I finally received my clearance and was read into the program, I learned that I would be working on projects that most people would never know existed. My first assignment had been to analyze financial data that seemed routine, but actually revealed how terrorist organizations were using cryptocurrency networks to fund operations across multiple continents. The patterns I identified led to coordinated raids that disrupted cells in 6 different countries and prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of people. My second project involved tracking cyber intrusions from state-sponsored hackers who were targeting infrastructure systems in ways that could cause cascading failures across entire power grids. The work was intellectually challenging and critically important, but it was also isolating in ways that my family couldn't understand. I couldn't discuss my projects with friends or celebrate my successes with relatives who would never know that their disappointing nephew had helped prevent international incidents that never made the news because they never happened. The promotions I received came with salary increases that I couldn't explain and responsibilities that I couldn't describe, leaving me trapped in a double life that grew more complex every year. 6 months ago, I had been assigned to a task force analyzing unusual communication patterns between several hostile governments that suggested coordinated planning for something significant. The intercepted data was fragmentary and required sophisticated analysis to piece together the timeline and scope of what appeared to be a multi-phase operation designed to create chaos during a vulnerable period for American interests. My role was to identify the technical vulnerabilities that were being targeted and recommend countermeasures that could be implemented without revealing our knowledge of their plans. The briefings I had attended over the past month included people whose names I recognized from news reports and history books. Cabinet secretaries sought my input on technical details that would influence policy decisions affecting millions of people. Intelligence directors asked my opinion on response strategies that could prevent or escalate international conflicts. The weight of those responsibilities was something I carried alone, unable to share the burden with family members who thought my biggest challenge was finding motivation to show up for my mundane office job. Yesterday morning, the patterns I had been tracking suddenly accelerated in ways that suggested the timeline for the hostile operation had been moved up significantly. The communications intercepts showed increased urgency and coordination between groups that had previously been operating independently. My analysis indicated that whatever they were planning was now imminent rather than months away, and the potential targets included infrastructure systems that could affect millions of Americans if they were successfully compromised. My mother appeared at my elbow, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked if everything was all right and whether our family was in any danger. I looked into her worried eyes and realized that in a few minutes I would be walking out of this house and leaving behind the fiction that had protected them from the reality of what I did for a living. The son they thought was aimless and underachieving was actually someone whose expertise was considered vital to national security, whose analysis influenced decisions made in the Situation Room of the White House. I put my arms around her and told her that everything would be fine, that I had to go help with something important, but that there was no danger to our family or our community. She looked up at me with the expression of a mother who was seeing her child clearly for the first time in years, recognizing something in my face and voice that had always been there but had been hidden beneath their expectations of failure and mediocrity. Behind her, I could see the rest of my family gathered in the hallway, their faces reflecting various stages of confusion, concern, and dawning comprehension. The commander appeared in the doorway and informed me that we needed to depart immediately to maintain the timeline that had been established for the briefing sequence. He mentioned that there would be additional stops to collect other personnel whose expertise was required for the same situation, which meant that I was part of a larger team being assembled to address whatever crisis had developed. I grabbed my jacket and the secure laptop that I always kept with me, even during family visits, and prepared to walk out of my childhood home in a way that would change everything my relatives thought they knew about me. As I reached the front door, I turned back to look at my family one more time before my life split permanently into before and after this moment. Marcus was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, while Jennifer was holding her children and trying to process the transformation of her boring brother into someone who commanded the attention and respect of military officers. Uncle Robert had his arm around my father, both of them watching me with a mixture of pride and confusion that would take them weeks to fully understand. The colonel opened the front door and gestured toward the helicopters that were waiting in the field behind our house, their rotors spinning with mechanical precision that spoke of urgent missions and critical timelines. I stepped outside into the cold November air and felt the weight of 5 years of secrecy lifting from my shoulders, replaced by the heavier burden of whatever crisis required my immediate attention in Washington. Behind me, my family crowded onto the front porch to watch their disappointing relative walk across the field toward military aircraft that had come specifically to collect him for reasons they were only beginning to comprehend. The walk across the field felt like moving through a dream where everything was simultaneously familiar and completely transformed. The ground beneath my feet was the same earth where I had played as a child, but now it served as a landing zone for military aircraft that had come to collect me for reasons that would reshape my family's understanding of everything they thought they knew about my life. The officers flanked me as we approached the lead helicopter, their presence both protective and purposeful, treating me with a level of respect and deference that my relatives were witnessing for the first time. As we reached the aircraft, the colonel turned and rendered a crisp salute that was visible to my family standing on the front porch. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning, a clear indication that their disappointing nephew was someone whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government and military leadership. I returned the salute automatically, the muscle memory of countless security briefings and protocol training taking over even as part of my mind struggled to process the surreal nature of this moment. The crew chief helped me into the helicopter, while the officers secured themselves in the seats across from me. Through the window, I could see my family still gathered on the porch, their faces reflecting various stages of shock, confusion, and dawning realization that the person they had been pitying and dismissing for years was actually someone whose work mattered in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. My mother had her hand pressed to her mouth, while my father stood beside her with the expression of a man trying to reconcile everything he thought he knew about his son with the evidence unfolding before his eyes. The helicopter lifted off with the smooth efficiency of a well-maintained military aircraft, and I watched our family farm shrink below us as we gained altitude and turned toward Washington. The landscape that had seemed so permanent and unchanging from ground level now appeared fragile and temporary from this aerial perspective, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could shift and reveal new truths about situations that had seemed fixed and certain just moments before. The commander handed me a secure tablet containing preliminary briefing materials for the situation that required my immediate attention. The information confirmed what I had suspected from the morning's encrypted messages, that the hostile operation we had been tracking for months was now entering its active phase and required immediate countermeasures that depended on my specific analysis of their technical capabilities and vulnerabilities. The stakes were higher than anything I had worked on before, involving infrastructure systems that could affect millions of people if they were successfully compromised. During the flight, I reviewed the intelligence reports that had been compiled since yesterday's acceleration of hostile communications. The patterns I had identified weeks earlier were now playing out in real time, with coordinated attempts to probe systems that controlled power grids, water treatment facilities, and transportation networks across multiple states. My analysis had predicted this escalation, and now the countermeasures I had recommended were being implemented by teams of specialists who needed my expertise to adapt their responses to the evolving threat. 25 minutes after leaving my family's farm, we touched down at a secure facility outside Washington where additional aircraft were arriving with other personnel who had been summoned for the same crisis briefing. I recognized several faces from previous high-level meetings, experts in their respective fields who had been pulled away from their Thanksgiving celebrations to address a situation that couldn't wait for normal business hours or holiday schedules. The fact that so many specialists had been assembled on such short notice underscored the severity of whatever was unfolding. We were escorted into a briefing room where senior officials from multiple agencies had gathered around screens displaying real-time data from the infrastructure systems under attack. A three-star general whom I had briefed on several previous occasions nodded in acknowledgement as I entered, his expression grave but confident as he gestured toward the chair that had been reserved for me at the main briefing table. The Secretary of Homeland Security was present via secure video link, along with the Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and several other officials whose presence indicated that this situation had escalated to the highest levels of government attention. The briefing began with an overview of the coordinated attack that was now underway across 17 different infrastructure targets in 12 states. The hostile actors were using exactly the vulnerabilities that my analysis had identified, attempting to create cascading failures that would disrupt services for millions of Americans while making it difficult to determine whether the outages were the result of cyber attacks or routine system failures. My recommendations for defensive measures had been partially implemented, but the accelerated timeline meant that some systems remained vulnerable to the sophisticated intrusion techniques being employed. I was asked to provide real-time analysis of the attack patterns as they evolved, identifying which systems were most at risk and recommending priority responses that would minimize the potential for widespread service disruptions. The work required intense concentration and rapid decision-making, drawing on years of experience analyzing hostile cyber operations and translating technical vulnerabilities into actionable intelligence for policymakers and operational commanders. For the next 6 hours, I worked alongside teams of specialists to coordinate defensive measures that successfully prevented the infrastructure attacks from achieving their intended goals. The hostile actors had invested months in planning and preparation, but our advanced knowledge of their capabilities and intentions allowed us to neutralize their efforts while gathering additional intelligence about their methods and objectives. By midnight, the immediate crisis had been resolved. though the investigation and analysis would continue for weeks to come. The Secretary of Homeland Security thanked me personally via video link, acknowledging that my analysis had been instrumental in preventing what could have been a catastrophic disruption of critical services during one of the busiest travel periods of the year. The three-star general shook my hand and mentioned that my work would be recognized through appropriate channels, though the nature of the operation meant that the recognition would remain classified and known only to those with appropriate security clearances. As the crisis briefing concluded and personnel began to disperse, I realized that I would need to return to my family and attempt to explain what had happened without revealing details that could compromise ongoing security operations. The helicopter flight back to Virginia gave me time to consider how to address their questions while maintaining the operational security that my position required, balancing their natural curiosity with the legal and ethical obligations of my security clearance. We landed in the same field behind my family's house just after 1 a.m, the helicopter's landing lights illuminating the frost that had formed on the grass during the cold November night. I could see lights still on in the house, indicating that my family had waited up despite the late hour, probably unable to sleep until they understood what had happened and whether I was safe. The officers who had escorted me to the briefing saluted again as I prepared to disembark, their gesture of respect now serving as a final confirmation of my status for any family members who might be watching from the windows. I walked across the field alone this time, the helicopter departing behind me as I approached the house where my relatives were undoubtedly waiting with questions that I could only partially answer. The front door opened before I reached it, revealing my father standing in the entrance with an expression that combined relief at my safe return with wonder at the transformation he had witnessed in his supposedly disappointing son. My mother appeared beside him, her face showing the strain of hours spent worrying about what kind of danger I might be facing and what my involvement in such serious government business might mean for our family's safety and future. Behind them, I could see the rest of my relatives gathered in the living room. Their earlier conversations about real estate deals and medical school applications now seeming trivial compared to the national security crisis that had required my immediate expertise and attention. I sat down with them in the living room that had hosted so many family gatherings where I had been the subject of gentle pity and well-meaning advice about finding direction and purpose in my career. Now those same relatives looked at me with expressions of respect and curiosity, recognizing that their understanding of my life and work had been fundamentally incomplete. Marcus asked directly whether I was some kind of spy or secret agent, his voice reflecting both fascination and concern about having such a relative in the family. I explained as much as I could within the constraints of my security obligations, telling them that my work involved analyzing threats to critical infrastructure and that my expertise had been needed to help address a serious but successfully resolved situation. I couldn't provide details about the specific nature of the threat or the measures that had been taken to counter it, but I could confirm that their boring relative actually worked on projects that mattered to national security and public safety. Jennifer asked whether I had always done this kind of work or whether this was a recent development in my career. I told her that I had been involved in classified projects for several years, but that operational security requirements prevented me from discussing the details with family members who didn't have appropriate clearances. The isolation I had felt at previous family gatherings suddenly made sense to her, as she realized that I had been carrying responsibilities and pressures that I couldn't share with the people closest to me. Uncle Robert, who had spent years suggesting that I needed to find more meaningful work, sat quietly as he processed the revelation that his nephew's government job was actually more important and impactful than anything he had imagined. The hardware stores that had made him successful in his community seemed small and local compared to work that affected national security and protected millions of people from threats they would never know existed. My mother reached over and took my hand, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and concern as she began to understand why I had always seemed distant and preoccupied during family visits. She asked whether my work was dangerous, and I assured her that I primarily did analysis rather than field operations, though I couldn't completely eliminate her worries about having a son whose expertise was valued enough to require helicopter transportation during national emergencies. The twins, who had earlier seemed so focused on their own academic achievements and career plans, now looked at me with new respect and curiosity about paths they had never considered. Their medical school ambitions remained important, but they were beginning to understand that there were many ways to serve the public good and make meaningful contributions to society. Aunt Linda, who had spent years comparing their accomplishments to my apparent lack of direction, was now reconsidering her assumptions about success and achievement. As the night wore on and my family gradually absorbed the implications of what they had witnessed, the conversation shifted from surprise and confusion to a deeper appreciation for the complexities of my situation. They began to understand why I had never been able to fully explain my work or share my professional successes and challenges with them. The security requirements that governed my career had created barriers between us that had been necessary for operational reasons, but had also contributed to their perception of me as aimless and underachieving. David, whose legal training had given him some familiarity with security clearances and classified work, helped explain to the others why I had been unable to discuss my real responsibilities and why the dramatic intervention they had witnessed was actually a sign of how seriously my expertise was valued by senior government officials. His perspective helped bridge the gap between their previous assumptions and the new reality they were learning to accept. By the time we finally went to bed in the early hours of Friday morning, my family's understanding of my life and career had been completely transformed. The disappointing relative who had been the subject of gentle pity and well-meaning career advice was now recognized as someone whose work contributed to national security in ways that most people would never fully understand. The quiet dignity I had maintained during years of family gatherings now made sense as the behavior of someone who was carrying important responsibilities that couldn't be shared or celebrated in traditional ways. Over the following days, as word of the Thanksgiving helicopter incident spread through our extended family and community, I found myself receiving a different kind of attention and respect from relatives who had previously worried about my lack of direction and ambition. They still couldn't know the details of my work, but they now understood that their assumptions about my career had been based on incomplete information and that their quiet nephew was actually someone whose expertise mattered to people at the highest levels of government. The experience taught all of us valuable lessons about the dangers of making assumptions based on limited information and the importance of recognizing that people's true contributions to society are not always visible or easily understood. My family learned to appreciate that meaningful work comes in many forms and that some of the most important jobs require discretion and humility rather than publicity and recognition. I returned to my apartment in Arlington with a renewed sense of connection to my family and a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices that come with classified work. The helicopter landing had ended my isolation in some ways while reinforcing it in others, giving my family enough information to understand and respect my career while still maintaining the security boundaries that my work required. I knew that future family gatherings would be different, marked by a new understanding of who I really was and what my quiet government job actually entailed, even if the specific details would always remain classified. The crisis that had interrupted our Thanksgiving dinner was resolved successfully, but it served as a reminder that the threats facing our country are real and ongoing, requiring the dedicated service of people whose contributions often go unrecognized by the general public. My family now understood that their disappointing relative was actually part of that dedicated community of professionals who work behind the scenes to protect the freedoms and security that most Americans take for granted. As I settled back into my normal routine of analysis and briefings, I carried with me the knowledge that I was no longer completely alone with the weight of my responsibilities. My family might not be able to understand the technical details of my work or celebrate my successes in traditional ways, but they now knew that their quiet nephew was someone whose expertise was valued and whose service mattered in ways that extended far beyond their rural Virginia community. The Thanksgiving when Air Force One landed for me had changed everything, transforming me from the family disappointment into someone they could finally recognize and respect, even if they could never fully understand the true scope of what I did to keep them safe.